Guruve Gaurachandra Radhika Etadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vaevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. So this is a brief discussion based on a conversation I had with two couples actually. There were two couples together who I had some dialogue with, and it was about sort of having emotional immunity, which is what you see in the description of this particular video. And they were asking about applying or the application of emotional immunity. So first, let me describe what emotional immunity is. Just as the physical body is designed with an immune system, and the idea of the immune system is to have an organic mechanism for helping your body to survive. So, of course, throughout the course of our life, there's different kinds of ideas of how to supplement that immune system, how to sort of bolster that immune system, but the immune system becomes the bottom line to our health. If we have a healthy immune system, then our health and wellness is more on track, and when our immune system becomes compromised or minimized, then obviously health issues arise. So we're not just composed of a physical body, however, we are composed of the mind, intelligence, and egoism principle, and beyond that, we're actually the soul itself. So when we speak about emotional immunity, we have to speak about both the antakaran, the subtle body, and the spirituality of the soul. You can't have a realistic conversation about dealing with emotions if we don't recognize the important role that consciousness plays in dealing with our emotional status. So, of course, our emotions are completely synthesized with our consciousness. So however our consciousness is becomes the basis under which our emotional rising and falling and so forth goes on. There are kind of really three basic things that go into emotional immunity. The first one is knowledge. The second one is perspective. And the third one is the resolution or reconciliation around dealing with the duality of a material world. So the first one, knowledge, is a factor that if we are in the absence of true knowledge of our own realistic or real identity, it becomes very difficult to manage how the modes of material nature influences us on the emotional roller coaster of the duality of the material world. There are so many different things in the material world that affect our conscious experience and hence affect our emotional status. So without knowledge of the self, it's impossible to gain the second feature. So I'm kind of putting all these things together and summarizing because I do have other services to do. And unfortunately, this is being started a little bit late, but I'll keep going so I don't waste more time. But perspective can only come when there's knowledge. So in Sanskrit and in Bhakti, that knowledge is called sambandha gyan. Sambandha means, some means like a complete, and sambandha means binding. So the complete binding of our actual identity with an absolute source. So for instance, if we take shelter of our temporal identity, the temporal identity is called asmita. There are 5 features, I've often mentioned this, of avidya. Avidya means the absence of knowledge of ourselves and our spiritual nature. In that avidya, there are 5 features. The avidya itself, asmita. Asmita means I am, right? Asmita means I am, and the suffix ita means I am something or someone. This question arises because of avidya taking away knowledge of who we actually are. But the intrinsic reality that I'm someone can't be taken away. Therefore, asmita is offered as a feature of avidya. Yes, you are something. Now, what are you? So a duality immediately appears because what you're going to claim to be is not your actual identity. So two features called rag and dvesh means attachment and aversion arises. Because unlike being situated in our true spiritual identity, which has a unified connection with the will, intent, and purpose that's given to us by Krishna or God, then now a duality arises of my own self-interest. So rag and dvesh are the manifestation of that. And then abhinavesh means it's inextricable. In other words, by our own power, coming under the influence of that material energy, beginning with avidya, asmita, rag, dvesh, and finally abhinavesh, we cannot extricate ourselves from that mesh or maze of activity without the help of someone who's beyond it. Right? So I've often quoted the verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, Anadi avidya yuktasha purusha shaveda atmanam swato na sambhavanti, means I cannot extricate myself. Anya, it requires another who is gyanatva gyanada bhavet. So gyanatva means who's realized outside that maze of the material energy, and da means who is willing to give the most valuable tool, which is the ability to get out of this material maze, and da also means they're giving it by doya or their mercy. You understand? So without this knowledge of Sambandha Gyan, it is very difficult to have perspective. Perspective comes from the nature of being situated in a position to see all the variables and then make conclusions around being knowledgeable about all those variables. So that's the reconciliation part. But the ability to reconcile has to come from perspective. So what is perspective? Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, in a statement that he made to Sri Raghunath Das Goswami, when Raghunath Das Goswami was continually trying to run away from home to be with Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he finally reached Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Mahaprabhu told him to go back home. So we could think, wait a minute, I don't understand this. That Raghunath Das Goswami is so deeply desiring to serve Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but when he arrives, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu tells him to go back home. So Mahaprabhu gave a very interesting instruction. Antara nishtakara baya lokya vyavyahar. So the word antara means your inner reality or your actual soul nature. So he told him, antara nishtakara. Always stay situated. Kara means your sense of doership, your sense of power, your sense of everything. Always let it be situated in the antara, means in your soul. Antara nishta, be fixed there. Nishtakara means think that everything that's happening is coming from the level of my soul. And I'll get into a little more detail about that because this word kara becomes important. Kara means the doer, but in reality we're not the doer. Actually, everything is being done in material illusion by the modes of nature and in spiritual enlightenment by the subsidy of God and God's spiritual energy. So we're never at any time the doer. We're the beneficiary of the support of one or two of God's energies, the external energy, but preferably the internal energy. So now having this perspective of operating from the principle antara nishtakara, then baya lok, the word baya lok, baya means external, lok means the material world. So then dealing with the material world, vyavyahar, the word vyavyahara means in a appropriate way. In other words, I should have perspective how to deal with the material world, the influence of the modes of material nature in the material world, the three kinds of klesh, adhyatmic, those issues that arise from my own inner being, and adibautic, those that arise from interactions with others, and adidaivik, those things which are beyond my control, which happen by the course of nature, right? Just like storms, tragedies, this, that. How to have perspective in dealing with those things is called vyavyahar. The only way to have the perspective of how to deal with these things is to be situated antara nishtakara. Be situated in your internal reality. Because your internal reality illuminates through knowledge the perspective to deal with the material world. If you don't become situated in your internal reality, then your emotional immunity is compromised. Because then your consciousness will constantly be bombarded by the influences coming from the material world. Whether it's the three modes of material nature, the three kinds of klesh or miseries that I just spoke about, whether it is mrityu bhaya means the fear of death. Because the tendency is that when we don't know something, it gives rise to fear and uncertainty. As an example, if you're in a room and suddenly the lights go out in the room and you hear a sound, immediately your anxiety level raises. And mainly it's because I'm unsure what happened. But the tendency is because there's always a fear of the extinguishing of my existence, the emotional content that rises is fear and anxiety. Nobody ever thinks, it's nothing, no big thing. Immediately people think the worst. Because we're just in a position as part of our material existence that we're in a fear of death. And therefore, whenever there's a lack of knowledge about a circumstance, our emotional intent becomes filled with anxiety and apprehension, etc. So as soon as you turn the light on in that room, you can see, something fell off the table and hit the floor. So it's nothing to be really worried about. Immediately that reconciling factor immediately brings your emotional content back down to a neutral level. Because now you're informed what happened. So the anxiety, the emotional raising that came as a result of the fear that maybe this was a gunshot or maybe this was something was caving in or any other traumatic thing that would cause the termination of my existence, right? Because everybody, we may not consciously think it, but the underlying current is always fear of death. That's mentioned in Sastra. It's mentioned there. Bhayam dviti anibeshata shat. As soon as we enter the material world, bhayam, fear arises in the consciousness. Simply by being in the material world. So again, as soon as, however, some knowledge comes and we have perspective, what happened, how this is then reconciled, immediately our emotional level and our emotional immunity stabilizes. So this should be the consistent application of how we deal with everything. Give me 1 second here. So this is how we tend to deal with everything. We deal with everything from an emotional lack of emotional immunity. So Krishna consciousness, the very basis of it, the doorway to bhakti, is called saranagati. Why saranagati is so important in a practical level is that it immediately takes the consciousness and places it in the proper place in relation to God, in relation to Krishna, that then allows our emotional immunity to be stabilized. Just like in the mundane world, right, we take different kinds of protocols to help assist our immune system, right? Whether it's vitamins, whether it's particular herbal protocols. I mean, some people, obviously, they take Occidental protocols. I'm not a big fan of them, but everybody has to go according to their knowledge base, right? But the point being here that everybody tries to do something that will help bolster their immune system. So in the same way, if you get the knowledge of bhakti through doing the practice of saranagati, then it will allow your emotional immunity to be bolstered and supported. So what is this saranagati? The first thing is anukuyasha sankalp. The word sankalp means to make a vow. A vow is really a reconciliatory mood. right? Because when you make a vow to do something, you're reconciling, this is the best thing, I've made the decision, so I'm going to make a vow that I will do this thing. We're not always correct, right? People took marriage vows, exercise vows, and so many vows that turned out not to be kept. You understand? But the underlying principle is once we feel we have something that will be helpful in our lives, we tend to make a determination around that thing. I'm vowing to do this thing. In spiritual life, that vow is always absolutely beneficial. So anukulyasya sankalpa, we take the vow to do what is favorable to my spiritual identity, which is that I am a servant of God. Obviously, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he was asked this question by Sanatana Goswami, who am I and why am I suffering? He answered, Jivera Surupaya Krishna Nitya Das. Similarly, Jiva Goswami has made this statement in Sandarbhas, Dasabhuti Hari Eva, Nanyasha Eva Kalachana. There is no time when you can actually be something different. The absolute truth, the absolute spiritual reality is that you're the Das of Krishna. Everything else will be a spawn from avidya or ignorance about that fact. And therefore it gives rise to, again, asmita, etc., etc. So we have to operate from the platform of, I am the servant of Krishna. So taking the vow to act in that manner is the beginning step to living antaranishtakara, living in the internal reality. The second thing is pratikulyas vivajanam. Because in the scope of our karmic portfolio and our karmic iteration that we're in now, we've picked up many habits which are adverse or don't align with doing everything favorable to being the Das of Krishna. We have to now go through the process of rejection. When we're living in our natural soul capacity, it's organic. Right? Jivarasuphoya Krishna Nitya Das. This dasatva towards Krishna, servitude towards the Lord, is an organic reality. But when we've acquired an artificial reality by so many lifetimes of dealing with the material world, in the position of the enjoyer, in the position of God, it is very difficult to discern what is good and what's bad. So then under the guidance, because Saranagati is done to Krishna through Guru. So now, having surrendered to Guru, there's guidance. It's called Anugatya. The word Anugatya literally means, Anu means to follow, Anu means continuously, and Anu means with humility. Gatya, the path or the road that is being traversed by my Guru and by our sadhus and our Guru Parampara, and ultimately by the instructions coming from Krishna through that Parampara. So now we have to reject those things which don't align with that. And then, Rakshati Vishwas. A Vishwas, the word Vishwas means a conviction. Because you can't do the first two unless you're convinced, unless your reconciliation is solid, that I can trust that this is the right thing to do. But when I think about, well, I don't know, I've spent so many years in duality, can I do this, can I not do this? Then we have to realize, I'm not the doer. No, I cannot do this. Therefore, Rakshishyati, Goptrave Varanam Tata. Rakshishyati means I have to depend that that very God who I am serving, Krishna who I am serving, in Guru Parampara, that Krishna, he will protect my inability, due to my lack of spiritual strength, to carry out the first two convictions, to do what is favorable and to reject what's unfavorable. Goptrave Varanam Tata. Who will help me to maintain the momentum to do that? That same Krishna through Guru Parampara to Guru. Then Atmanikshep, Karpanya. And then, if I will do those first four things successfully, Atmanikshep means that I'll have realization of my actual identity, which I can then surrender actually to Krishna. And Karpanya, humility will be a natural byproduct of that realization. Because as soon as you take to the process of bhakti in earnest, then humility starts to develop in incremental stages. Brihad Bhagavatamrita is saying, Paripakkena dhanyasya, Krishna prema ajasanvitanyate. As your bhakti increases, natural humility comes. This is the meaning of Mahaprabhu's verse, Chenarapi sunichena, Tarorapi evasi shuna, Amanina manadena kitniya sadari. As you continuously do kirtan under guidance, then the portfolio of your bhakti and the bhakti samskars, means bhakti impressions in your heart and consciousness, grows. It automatically produces the realization of the humility that is needed and that is intrinsic to me in relation to God. Humility is not an artificial imposition. Well, I need to become humble. It's first of all, it's politically correct in the social fabric I operate in. And secondly, people will like it. So my humility will be another source of becoming not humble, because everybody will glorify, oh, he's very humble. She's very humble. When they ask somebody, who would like to clean the restroom? You immediately raise your hand. Yes. Oh, they're so humble. They're going to clean the restroom. And you make sure the door to the restroom is wide open so everybody can see it's you who so humbly agreed to clean the restroom at the temple. You understand? So, Pratishta Asha, in the Manasiksha of Raghunath Das Goswami, he said, Pratishta is so subtle that even though it's dancing in the heart, audaciously, right, like an outcast, still it's very difficult to recognize. But as you become genuinely more Krishna conscious, organically humility is a byproduct of the development of that Krishna consciousness. So Atmanikshepa Karpanya Saranga Saranagati. This Saranagati is the reconciliation that's needed to gain the proper perspective with the knowledge you have that I am the servant of Krishna, to then properly deal with vyavaharic life or external material life, and therefore to develop emotional immunity. So now let me begin to, in short order, try to make that into practical manifestation. So sometimes in our self-interest and our material desires, we acquire relationships, fraternal, conjugal, even parental relationships, which don't emotionally allow us to be stable. Because when you make a connection with another person, you're making an emotional investment. If you make an investment in something that's not operable in the ideal way, then obviously that causes problems and frustrations. If you buy a car and the car doesn't work properly, then you're frustrated. What to speak of when you have an emotional interaction with someone in any relationship? Then you obviously feel some emotional distress when that relationship is not functioning optimally. So, but how do we deal with controlling our emotions in such a way as to not lose ourselves in the course of dealing with those kind of relationships? You have to have emotional immunity. Emotional immunity means I will be fixed in my inner core, and I'm not going to allow something to take me out of that inner core. And it's not a psychological ploy, or it's not a modern modality tool. It's a reality. You understand? That I am the soul. I am the servant of Krishna. This is a temporary karmic iteration I'm living through. So the dealings that I'm having in this world, they are temporal. Those dealings which center around devotion, they carry the quality of love because they're related to the centerpiece, which is Krishna. Rupa Goswami mentions this. He says, Dati pratigrinati guyamakiti prichiti bhukte bojayate chaiva sadvidam priti lakshanam. So my devotee husband and wife, my devotee child, my devotee friends, the quality of priti is there because Krishna is the center. But every day you may have to go to work. Every day you may have to meet with so many different people under so many different circumstances. Those relationships are not mutually based around service to Krishna. And therefore there's automatically a sort of rag and dvesh element to them, means a duality to them. Because they're situated and they're operating in the material paradigm, and you're trying to operate exclusively in the spiritual paradigm and deal with the vyavaharic life in a simplistic way, as to not impinge upon or infringe upon your spiritual dynamic. So sometimes when you come in contact with people, and even this happens in relationships, because sometimes we pick up friendships that are not mutually on the same spiritual level, or we pick up conjugal relationships that are not mutually on the same spiritual level. So what happens is that when we do that, and we have to have some exchange of energy, and there's emotional investment based on the relationship, then that can become any spiritual immunity compromise. You understand? Because now I'm giving some investment emotionally here, and I know this situation is not stable because nothing in the material world is. Everything is always in flux in the material world. Even the three modes of material nature are always in flux. There's never a complete, absolute mode of goodness. And don't think that the mode of material goodness becomes pure and becomes spiritual sattva, Suddha Sattva. That's not the Siddhant. That's not the spiritual truth. Suddha Sattva is exclusively a spiritual energy. The mode of material goodness, Sattva Gun, is not Suddha Sattva and won't become Suddha Sattva. It is the material mode of goodness. But even in the material mode of goodness, it won't stay steady. Some degrees of passion, some degrees of ignorance will always in various volume be part of that mode of material goodness, because the modes don't operate in exclusivity. Understand? Nobody's exclusively in the mode of passion or ignorance or goodness. You understand? So when we have to deal with a person whom is consciousness is predominated by the modes of material nature, and we're trying to be established in our inner core, which is based in Suddha Sattva actually, naturally there'll be some discord, and when there's some discord, due to the emotional investment in that person, our emotional immunity becomes compromised. So we always have to think, when we're dealing with that person, we have to stay antranishtakara. We have to stay situated in that inner core. Because if we do not, then it's very easy, because the material energy is very powerful. Mama Maya Duruttaya, Krishna is telling him Bhagavad Gita, my material energy is very strong. And if you don't develop your emotional immunity, that material energy will come and gradually, though it cannot take away the spiritual impressions which are already present, it can certainly obfuscate them to your consciousness. Now, they may remanifest later on in this life or even into a next life if you get caught up very heavily. What example do we have of that? In Srimad Bhagavatam, the example of Bhakti Maharaj is that example. Though he had completely given up everything in the material world, in the material paradigm, situated himself in spiritual practice, had reached even to the stage of bhav, due to sattvic doya. Sattvic doya means mercy in the mode of material goodness. He became attracted to a fawn. When he saw that the doe jumped across the river and was in distress, and the fawn fell in, he took that fawn and began to raise it. The next thing you know, he became attached emotionally, by emotional content, to this fawn, and so many different things took place that obfuscated his nishta in his bhajan and in his self-realization. So of course those impressions that he had already acquired manifested in his next life as Jad Bharat. Understand? So it's extremely important. It's extremely important to maintain our inner core. And that can only be done when we put things in perspective. If we allow any relationship with anything in the material world to lose perspective, and we have emotional investment there, our emotional immunity is compromised. When your emotional immunity is compromised, it gives rise to arguments, and among devotees committing aparad, and dealing with the material world, all kinds of frustrations. We know in the material world there's frustrations. Moga shamoga kamano moga gyanvi chetasa, Bhagavad Gita is telling. Everything is always flustered in the material world because it's built around the temporal accommodation of so many different karmic iterations of people. It's not permanent. So sometimes there is an idea that if we simply stay fixed in our inner spiritual core, we may be socially bypassing, right? They call it spiritual bypassing. So you take shelter of your spiritual core, and therefore you don't allow the outside things to affect you. That may be spiritual bypassing. If you don't want to take emotional content and make an investment in a social issue, make an investment in this thing or that thing, you may be spiritually bypassing. No. What you're doing is bypassing the possibility of getting entangled in material energy again. And you're taking shelter with proper perspective on the material world, or you're taking proper perspective due to taking shelter of your spiritual reality. How can you spiritually bypass something? That term itself, though it became very popular, is indicative that spiritual life has an inadequacy inherently. If spiritual life is not all accommodating, is not all facilitating, you understand? And if me being situated in my inner spiritual core would be a deficit in dealing with something, how can that spiritual thing be absolute? How can it be absolute if it has this fault? So my spiritual core must be all accommodating, all facilitating, because it's absolute. So why would operating from that basis be a even material deterrent or material fault? Why would it be something that's detrimental even materially? It's not that spiritual perspective gives rise to a lack of prudence materially. So, in other words, I'm working on a job. So tomorrow morning I'll go in the job and I'll start pointing out how everybody's a demon because they eat meat and how actually this is all temporary, so forth and so on, and then go through the emotional roller coaster that happens when I'm fired and now I cannot pay my bills adequately. That's not being situated spiritually and doing antaranishtakara, because the second part of the verse says, Bayalok Vyavyahar. Vyavyahar means deal with the material world appropriately so that it becomes anukul to bhajan. Remember, you're doing saranagati. So is that anukul to bhajan? To put yourself in a condition where now you have to struggle to think so much more about how to make money, right? Because you've decided to go in and let your spiritual core be revealed to everyone, and now everyone else is inadequate spiritually, right? Or you go and you don't take care of your health, at least to the best of your ability. These bodies are temporary, there's no question about it. Dying is not a fault, it's part of nature. So, but as long as we have a body for the service of Hari Guru and Vaishnav, we should try to maintain our health to the best of our ability. We don't need to go overboard with that also. We're not trying to perpetuate, we're not becoming Hiranyakasipu. I want to live forever, so I don't want to die in the day, the night, so I have to die. That's going to come. Bayam Dviti Abhinaveshata Shat. Don't become absorbed in the duality that arises from that. Because my inner core, my spirituality does not die. That's who I am. The temporal nature of this body is part of material nature. Don't try to separate it and force it to be something else. So be prudent in your health care. You don't have to go overboard, but be prudent in your health care. Be prudent in your dealings with the material world. Be prudent in your dealings in your relationship. If you are married, you have to be prudent in that relationship. You have to be aware of what is the idiosyncrasies, nature of my partner, and vice versa. They should be sensitive to your idiosyncrasies and your nature and what you are. And these things have to be discussed. Why? Because they are anukul to bhakti. When you don't talk about it, when you don't sit down and work it out in pursuance of staying fixed in bhakti, it becomes detrimental. So now it's pratikul. If you have to argue, your emotions lose their center and now are being expressed. And also, a very big thing to realize is that in devotee relationships, it's not just my husband, not just my wife. They're also the disciple of Guru. They're the servant of Krishna. They're the dasa dasi of Shri Radha Krishna. So you're not simply, when you lose your emotional content and emotional immunity and start saying inappropriate things, you're not just talking to anyone, you're talking to a devotee, therefore it becomes Vaishnavaparad. So all of these things are very important in a very practical sense of how to deal with the material world in all relationships. And I brought up this point to those two couples about emotional immunity because if we don't protect our emotional content by having gyan, sambandha gyan, by having perspective, and by having the power of reconciliation, which is that ultimately everything is owned and controlled by God. We're not the doer. Until and unless you can give that up, and as long as the false egoism keeps telling me, ahamkara. Ahamkara means I am the cause and the doer. And it feeds your particular upadi. Upadi is like the karmic designation you have right now. I'm in this family, in this situation, etc. That's called an upadi. Asmita is the feature of ignorance that allows you to attach yourself to that upadi, that designation. False egoism bolsters that upadi. Yes, you are the doer. You're John Doe, you're intelligent, you're smart, you're rich, you're famous, Your self-interest is numero uno. It is number one. Nobody else's interest is more important than yours. Whether you overtly or covertly maintain that attitude, everybody has it. You understand? Until you realize I'm the soul. And that the only doer is Bhagavan. Sava Karana Karanam. Adi Guru Brahmaji, the very first verse of Brahma Samhita in the 5th chapter. Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchinananda Vigraha. Anadi Adi Govinda. Sava Karana Karanam. Krishna is the doer of everything. I have to stay situated there. What reversals come in my life? Tatyanu Kumpam Sushamikshamano. Right? Whatever is happening in my life, Atmakritam Vibhakam, had something to do with my karmic portfolio. That this thing happened. So therefore I have to maintain by body, mind, moods, heart, everything being surrendered to Bhagavan, because somehow Bhagavan is my only shelter. And then you have to ask yourself, anytime you come across any dynamic, and this is a practice. Sadhana means a practice. So in this practice, if you come across something, you have to ask, what is the ultimate reconciliation here? What is the ultimate reconciliation is going to be Krishna arranged whatever the outcome of this thing is. Now, you may have to be careful, because if you also say Krishna will determine the outcome, but I didn't do my due diligence, I didn't use my prudence in Vyaviharic life, so I'm creating a circumstance and then assigning it to Krishna, that's not real. It's when you've done the deepest level of practice of bhakti in any circumstance that then the outcome is resigned. This is Krishna's desire, and I have no reconciliation but to surrender to it. So we have to be mature enough to make that distinction. Not that my lack of material prudence causes a situation that then assigned to Krishna. You understand? Because Krishna is telling that you should be, my Gurudev, once he was asked a question. I think it was the beginning of the whole Y2K thing, and there was a lot of anxiety, what will happen. And so one very sweet devotee I know, she asked Gurudev, well, Gurudev, what should we do? All these things are pending, this is coming. Gurudev says, be prudent and chant Hare Krishna. So be prudent meant, deal with the material world appropriately according to whatever circumstance arises, but your reconciliation is it chanting Hare Krishna. Because there's no reality beyond that. There's no reconciliation of anything beyond that. So 4 factors. 3. Sambandha Gyan, perspective, and reconciliation. And the ultimate reconciliation comes from the Sambandha Gyan, that I am the Das of Krishna, and Krishna is the ultimate control of everything. You understand? Perspective will arise out of that vision. That yes, whatever I'm seeing, ultimately, this is all in the hands of God. You understand? And having that perspective and then acting prudently, Vyaviharic practice means dealing with material appropriately, that should allow your emotional immunity to stay strong. So that you don't lose it, don't become victimized by it, end up with a lot of stress and anxiety and problems, and then look at bhakti as though there's a fault in bhakti because of it. You understand? Bhakti is perfect. Our application may be imperfect, but the bhakti itself is perfect. Right? So I think I'll end here. I do have other services, and I think I kind of did go overtime. But the discussion that I had with those 2 couples spawned this discussion. I thought it was valuable. Therefore, I thought I would present it on, sort of this is always a question and answer forum, but I thought I would present it. And if it was at all helpful, of course, that's the mercy of Shri Guru and Gauranga. And if there was any mistakes, it's due to my lacking, and I apologize for that. Jai Vancha Kalpaturubhischa Kripa Sindhavevcha Patitana Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.